All right. Welcome to the weekly Jordan B Peterson community broadcast. This is the day of June 17th or 18th or 16th, whatever particular time zone you happen to be in, who knows. This week, we're going to be discussing the differences in how Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris see God. We've got a really interesting discussion lined up that's pulled from some prior discussions we've had during the week, and hopefully we can get to all of the main points that we'd like to discuss. Let's kick it off. Our first thing we want to talk about, I suppose, is, well, maybe we can begin with our own definitions of God or examine the definitions of other gods as described by people in the literature, right? So the heavy hitters. Is any,
Okay.
in particular they'd like to begin with?
Sure. I guess the classical theist definition of God is the subsistent. It's like existence itself. So like existence as a property by which the universe kind of takes part in. That was kind of the Aristotelian. I'm butchering it by quite a bit since there's a lot more facets to it, but also Thomas Aquinas. That was at least a simple enough explanation for 12:30 at night for me to go through.
A butcher is an honorable profession, John. Don't knock butchers. We got a lot of meat to chop up. Yeah, well, okay. So theist is good because it hits a broad spectrum of people, I think, that describe a god in that way.
Mm-hmm. There's the other kind of conception of God as being the greatest possible being, like with infinite properties of goodness and powerfulness and intelligence, knowledge.
The omni list. Omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. Yeah.
And the two of those, I mean, conceptually, those are the two, I think, ideas that most professional theists think about God or define God when they're referring to him.
Yeah. So I think later on in our discussion, we'll see that people define God in strange ways when they're talking to each other, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It changes depending on who you're talking to sometimes.
So both of those definitions don't necessarily have the personal quality that we usually think of when we're...
Yeah. Well, you know, here in America, the deistic view is pretty... Well, it's pretty baked into our early documents, I'd say. So it's rather important, let's say, in analyzing how Americans see things. Interesting, we're going to talk about Ayn Rand, right? And she's kind of a weird merger of Russian and American thought. Like, it's a fascinating thing to think about, actually, how culturally, if we want to talk about, say, like diversity, actual diversity, rather than focusing on, as you know, not to go in this any further, but like it's not about your skin color; it's about cultural fusion of certain ideas, right? So that like the whole philosophy of objectivism arose out of the fusion of these cultural differences, right? Kind of turmoil that she experienced as an early youth. Anyhow, that this is important, I suppose, in an oblique way to how we're going to define the way that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson see God, let's say, because it seems true that the way people see God has a lot to do with how they're taught about God as a child, while they're a child, right? So early experiences, and especially early trauma, and the way that we're taught to deal with that kind of trauma, probably have a profound effect on the way that we envision a God that has an effect on that, or a cause, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Though it's hard to exactly know how people were taught about God as children. I mean, I'd imagine most people are kind of, at least most religiously raised people are raised with the personal quality of God as, I'd imagine, probably the maximal being, somebody that is the greatest possible. Like, imagine a person, but somebody that's greater than all people.
Yeah.
But I don't know. There's still that the typical atheist conception of God as the magic sky daddy, who is kind of just a big person in the sky, which is, I don't know if that's actually what they think theists think of God, or if that's that's got to be their.
It's a tiny bit of a straw man, but that's probably a good place to start. Yeah,
it's their satiric.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, I think
straw
it
man.
has a lot to do with the peculiarity of our current historical position. The fact that we're able to look back on a very long road of, say, religious development and see a progression of ideas that go from, somewhat incoherent and conflicting to a more synthesized, coherent structure that we see today. Right? There's a vast difference between some prehistoric religion of the pantheon of wood gods and demigods to the kind of synthesis that took place over time regarding the moral ought structures that we have now, and how we codified all that, and then essentially, it became monotheistic. So that's a good place to look at the historically, the way that God was initially envisioned was not God at all, right? It was initially pantheistic. It was uh, probably
polytheistic.
Polytheistic, and that each tribe had their own particular set of gods depending on various forces and whims that they experienced in the environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And over time, as they came together, I guess both culturally as they merged in the same way that Ayn Rand and Russia and America merged into her political and other philosophy. The same thing happened in the past, right? These tribes came together and they had to merge these stories. I think what's really fascinating about it, though, is that the notion of God seems almost primeval, that it arose at the same time that history did, at the very least, right? So it's a part of our earliest conceptions of our understanding of culture and human beings come together, that they were building things to gods, that they believed in some kind of afterlife, that there was some notion of an invisible deity of some kind that interacted with the world around them, right? It was obvious that when the wind blew, that it was some god that was doing it, right? Or when some mighty storm came through, it was obvious that it was a god. And I think it's really strange, actually, because it's not obvious, right? What makes that obvious? I think, yeah.
I think it's the kind of the watchmaker argument where you see something, like you're residing within a world of things that exist, and you being a person that is capable of creating things or ordering things, you assume that the world that you exist within has the same thing has happened, which caused you to come into existence. Or maybe even just the conception of, I have a father, like I'm a contingent being based upon, like I had a dad and he had a dad. So that must have gone back somewhere, all the way back to there being a first dad, like maybe even Adam, considering, or not Adam, but the equivalent to Adam as being the god of a people.
There's also the aspect here about like the title of this is "What is God" rather than "Who is God." But traditionally, the question has been who is God, and with the polytheistic religions, it's always something that resembles some entity. There wasn't just one that was immaterial. They all had some material form. And it's the same thing which we do with children's movies. We anthropomorphize objects. We'll make talking cars and things like that. Or we'll, it's completely fine if a mouse talks or a toy talks. And it seems like until a high level ability of comprehending the world exists, then we have to somehow interact with things as if they're objects. Like where there's a noise in the dark, we ask who's there rather than what is there. And our interaction is very much how we perceive ourselves intuitively. So the way we interact with the world is pretty much how we interact with ourselves. And this probably then applies to also how whether it's true or not, there's at least an image that more tribalistic societies, or more than tribes, were more environmental. They actually viewed the environment also as a living being, as well, to an extent, or at least that's the image that is there. Whether or not it's true or whether it's just marketing is a different question. But it seems like it would then fall into line where the ability to actually ask what, or, to define things as objects is unique. And it's also with language, like the more archaic languages generally always have gender terms for everything. Like a chair can be male or female kind of thing. And it's only been, I think, a recent feature of language development that we've actually been able to actually objectify things and also systemize things and adopt systematic thought. And then the hemispheres with those things have developed the parts of the brains with those things have developed a newer parts of the brain that didn't always exist.
Yeah, what's fascinating about that, actually, certain cultures have a completely, well, not completely, dramatically different sets of languages per gender. So there are some Plains Indians tribes, like the Sioux, for instance, that have masculine and feminine languages, that have different words and slightly different grammar. It's really interesting how, and even carried into the future, no matter what kind of words we adopt, there are still other expressions of information that are occurring all the time. So body language is a big thing, nonverbal expression, the way in which we present ourselves emotionally. This is, I think, it's a persistent notion that women are from, what is it? Men are from Mars and women are from Venus, right? Like we're very different creatures, it seems, and speak very different languages. But to think about historically our notion of God and the way that we described it, I think it's fair to say that the notion of God arose at the same time that our collective kind of human consciousness seemed to arise. That they came together, right? And the reason for that is we were able to experience whatever it is that we're calling willpower or choice, right? And then because we're experiencing that, we see action in the world in the same way that we're committing action ourselves, and that's by choice. So we imbue it with intent, and the only intent that we're aware of is ourselves. So therefore it's anthropomorphized. Right, so it's almost like they have to come together at the same time. The only thing that you know is yourself, and since yourself is making choice, whenever you see anything else making motion like you, right, moving in the world and acting, it seems natural that would progress at the same time, that you'd assume the same thing. And we've gotten to...
There's a distinction there because God probably did arise with consciousness, and it's hard to then think how it couldn't. But then immediately the usage of God there is then different from spirit. So there would be that goes into, well, what is God a bit? Because immediately one would think, well, like say dogs, they get spooked by the wind, kind of thing. Like animals get spooked by the wind, and then they understand there's wind force there, and then they're like, well, who did that? Like a dog will bark at a noisy roof that's being blown by the wind all night long because they think there's something, they're like, who's moving that? Like, who's causing that noise? God damn it. Like, stop it.
Yeah.
You're annoying me, right?
No, it's a good point.
Yeah,
Our
because
conception of God's, it's changed over time, right?
yeah, but then the way to tie it in then for what we're going to talk about later is then, well, there's the idea of, at least from Peterson's perspective, is then there's the idea of spirits, which can be like the rules enacted or even just the rules themselves. So you could have this idea of spirits, like things that move things, like they were behind the stuff. So it's like, well, that's fine, but then to actually believe, you could probably have that before consciousness. So it's like you could probably say the dog believes in a wind spirit. Like there's something that is making the wind move that is an entity, which is why they bark at it and get concerned and scared. But then the way of then saying, well, the tied then to consciousness or human consciousness is then the idea of taking from different cultures and then finding what is what is true from all these different spirits. So what's these general rules that is true from all these spirits or rules that we see, and then we associate that with the intersection of those things then becomes what we consider to be God.
Well, I'm going to argue, I guess in a little while, that our conception of God is essentially that which we can't explain. And that's what, say, Hitchens and others, Dawkins, referred to as the God of the gap, right? And I think it's always that way because whatever God is, despite whatever it or he or she or whatever may be, there is a way to conceptualize that thing, right? And it seems different for each person. And even though there's a great deal of overlap in a lot of places, it seems like each individual's conception of what God is simply that which is not explainable. And so you have these fundamentalists that attribute a great deal of the outside world, the mystery of the world and how it functions, to God, right? That's their God of their almighty God that controls all. It's kind of a mystery how it all functions and works. There's a great meme on the internet about O'Reilly talking about how the tides come in, the tides come out, and nobody knows how it works. It's just God, right? This is a very popular conception. But as your ability to explain the environment increases over time, you develop a different conception of God, let's say. And now, you can explain lightning without referring to an anthropomorphic entity, right? So God can't be in the lightning. Right, and then if you explode the universe out and learn about cosmology and astronomy and all that, you can't find God there either. It all just seems to be obeying these particular laws. But the manner in which you define God and where our understanding is and isn't seems to be highly predictive of how you form whatever God it is, right? And call the thing that isn't or doesn't exist. Now, that the thing with Sam Harris is going to be that he believes so strongly in science and, say, determinism philosophically, that he believes that everything at one point will be explained, that you'll have a neatly compact, inductively verifiable answer.
There's still things, even within the determinist worldview, there's still things that won't be able to be explained.
I'm talking about someone's perspective. No, I agree with you. I do. But I think that that's how Harris sees it. He believes that at some point, everything will be explainable by science.
Not that it will be, but it could be. So in his conversation with Sean Carroll, they go into the quantum indeterminacy of atoms, and that so even if you had Laplace's demon that had contained all knowledge of the universe, there are certain things that it wouldn't be able to predict. But that doesn't necessarily mean that so there's still the random interactions that occur between, like we've brought up before, the three body problem, where you can't predict where different atoms are going to be in a vacuum or whatever. I'm not really familiar with the three body problem, but it's
just any three things interacting at the same time physically. It just can't do it. Like three billiard balls coming together at the same time. You can think of it that way. It's easiest.
Mm-hmm. But with 3 billiard balls, you can predict how they're going to.
You can't. You and I can look at it, right? But 3 random collisions at the same time, we don't have the math for it.
Yeah. Okay. So it's the random collisions that. Sorry, it's late.
I think I derailed you.
Okay. I just wanted to bring out, it's not that science will determine every single aspect of the universe, but everything.
Well, part of the argument that Peterson makes is that the words that these people are using don't match their behaviors, right? So I'm going to be a little disingenuous, perhaps, or have a bad faith argument, to use Harris's language, and indicate that even though Harris is extraordinarily precise in the way that he says things, he isn't always completely precise. And I think that there are contradictions in the way that he thinks about things, and partly those are revealed by examining his conception of God. And even though he says that, there's some areas of inquiry that may be outside of the domain of science, or Heisenberg's uncertainty principle may prevent certain knowledge. His conception of God has to do with his feeling about where the explained and unexplained is, and even though he knows something can't be computed, he feels like it's explained by having a name like Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You see, he feels like that's a sufficient explanation for it.
Yeah. See, the problem with the new atheists is that their conception of God is not in line with like the classical theist or the philosophical conception of God. They're getting all of their basis for what God is based off of the Bible or the Quran.
Right. Yeah. So they're choosing that, I think, precisely because they have no anchor, no mystery, let's say, with which to point their direction or gaze towards the search for a God. And so because of that, they're free to look anywhere else, and they find the most ridiculous description they can, right? The most characterized version of the most fundamentalist beliefs, and then tear that down.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. In Plato's Republic, Socrates Plato has the harsh critique of the works of literature on the polytheism of gods, because the gods were showing human behavior such as like jealousy or kind of like menial behavior, like playing tricks on the humans or like forgetting things like that. He realized that these are just stories here, because these can't be actual gods. And so if these people are writing poetry about these gods, but they're personifying, they're making them much more human in these stories. And so it could be that the new atheists are kind of bringing that same critique against Yahweh in the Bible, where it shows that Yahweh is a jealous El, and there's times in the Bible where God changes his mind, and
where he repented.
Yeah. There's all these contradictions within the stories that are being told, leaving them to notice, just like Plato, that this is a fictional character that's being presented here.
Yeah. Well, so this goes along with what I was talking about there. How could you conceive of a God that's outside of your conception or your perceptual framework, right? It seems like no matter whatever your particular behavior is, however refined your resolution of understanding is, your God has to be equal to or greater than that, right?
Yeah, it's like you can't imagine a color that's outside of the 3 rods.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or you can't imagine you can't really imagine a higher dimension from where you are. You can like have the mathematical structures behind that, but you can't like
Yeah, they're just analogies, though.
Yeah.
Right? Visual analogies, let's say. So we have 3 dimensions and we have a 4th dimension of time, which is just like frame shifting and motion in general, right? Mathematically, we string theorists in particular love to play around with more dimensions, and I guess geometers and topologists also like play around with more dimensions, but there's a lot of them actually, but chaos theorists and
yeah. So
anyhow,
God as that which is outside of your own perspective. Is that
right? So anything that essentially what it seems is that as we progressed a long time, anything that moved that needed explaining, we kind of initially assumed was moving of some intent, right? And if so, lightning. Let's take lightning for instance, because we love Thor, right? So this is attributed, or Zeus, or something. This is attributed to a single god, right? This single action, this single phenomenal experience that occurs. This phenomenon is given an intent, right? Now, as you learn about storm systems and static electricity, you change the name of the description and take away intent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not sure. Like that process is kind of interesting, right? How do you remove intent if you begin with that assumption, right? Well, it's partly because the anthropomorphization of it, I think. It's like you're expecting at some point to peek behind the clouds and find the half-naked Zeus with his toga hanging off, like hurling bolts, and because that didn't happen, you go back and you assume that your original premise was incorrect, and you strike the conclusion too.
Mm-hmm. Well, this kind of goes into, I don't know if we've mentioned it yet, Rand's idea of a prime mover, which isn't necessarily related to, I mean, it's like based off of, but not the same as Aristotle's prime mover. But there's kind of this idea, both within Ayn Rand, but for for the conception of a will, like a being's will, is that it has intention that's kind of brought about by itself. So if we saw that lightning kind of caused itself to come into existence, then we could have the assumption that there was some sort of intention behind that, or will behind that lightning, such as like through Zeus or something like that. But if we see that there are further causes, like besides the lightning, that are causing the lightning to actually strike on its own, that the lightning doesn't strike on its own, and so there's no will within the lightning. This is something that has like a further, there's a further causation prior to it, further behind it.
Yeah, and this is why I think the quantum mechanic explorations that are occurring right now are so pivotal in our understanding of let's say, the will of the universe or the will of any given person.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's the case that consciousness exists at a quantum level, and if it's the case that we do actually have free will, which most cognitively biased or disonanced people would agree with, that you actually do make choices in the world. That's our felt experience. If it turns out the case that that's at the quantum level, then why can't a bolt of lightning have intent, right? This is a fascinating bit of a question, right? It's like the collectivized intent of a bolt of lightning could be just the same as the collectivized intent of a bit of wet, pulpy neural mass stuck in your skull, right? I mean, fundamentally, what's the difference between the matter of one and the matter of another? We say it's attributed at the higher than quantum level, then only neurons get to experience consciousness. It seems to be tied there, but I actually don't think that's necessarily the case.
Yeah,
I think.
Well, that's where the biggest kind of distinction between the theists and the
Right.
atheists are, where consciousness, like what has consciousness? Where does consciousness come from? Is it a byproduct of the natural world, or is it something that the natural world like asserts itself towards? And
Well, my own quick and dirty theory is that it's a fundamental field, much like the Higgs boson that provides mass for all massive particles in our universe. But this is the consciousness bosonic field. Call it whatever you want. God, the true God particle, let's say. And that coherent choice spaces of various complicated systems experience the choice space as consciousness, and our experience as a human being is just an extraordinarily abstracted, complex, cohesive unit. So our conscious experience is localized to the sense data that comes through, let's say, and our manipulation of it, but it could equally be conscious experience in any other given physical object in the world that corresponds to its relatively limited data input, let's say. Like maybe the sun shines on it and that's how it feels.
So I think Sam Harris's stance on consciousness is probably more nuanced than you might assume from him being a determinist and an atheist. Because hearing him talk about consciousness, there's a lot within the mystery that he kind of revels in.
That's because he's taking psychedelics.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know.
I agree that I'm aware of his nuanced view on consciousness.
Yeah, it resides as the mystery. Well, yeah, because he lost the conception of self. So if there's no self, there's no possibility for free will, because what's going to be enacting that will?
Yeah, well, I think this is important. There are two qualities to consciousness that seem to vitally be the experienced part of it. And the problem is Harris only deals with one of them, right? So consciousness is both an observer, it monitors wavelengths of some kind, and it has an active component, right? So it's got a passive component and an active component. Passive is observing, active is choosing, right? These are two elements of our conscious felt experience that cannot be distilled any further. But Sam only deals with one of those. He assumes that we're just consciously observing and that we have this illusion of choice. Now, let me ask you a question. What the hell is an illusion of choice? How do you build that up, right? Because illusion, it seems to me, is simply a repetition of something that is already real, but mistaken in time or space, right? So you have some fixed property that you're experiencing that is real in some other fashion, right? But it's in the wrong time or space, or there's some other contradictory element. But you can't have an illusion for something that truly doesn't exist, right?
Well, the scientific experiments that are usually used as evidence for there not being a free will are the like 6-second delays between like the neural firings in the brain and then before the actual conscious awareness of a choice being made. So it's like,
well, I'm not aware of any 6-second delay. I think the study
maybe it's 11 seconds. I don't know, it was something prominent.
No. The most, I think the most relevant study in this, I'd have to find the author's name, but was an attempt to watch finger wagging, right? They would ask to wag their finger at a particular time when they saw a particular light go off. And as far as I'm aware, it's something like a second at the most in lag between the felt choice and the motion of the finger, right? But this is, I think, not at all stating anything about whether or not consciousness and choice exist, let's say. It just means that the choice was already programmed into your brain. And we already know a great deal about brain physiology, that our brain functions in that fashion. The choice was already programmed in when the researcher said, here's the instruction set, will you do it? And you replied yes. And you decided to do it ahead of time, right?
Well, if the choice is already programmed into your brain, and then your you become consciously aware of that choice afterwards. That's exactly what Sam Harris is talking about when he talks about the choice being an illusion.
How is it an illusion? It was still a
Because
choice.
because it wasn't the conscious awareness that brought the action into being. The conscious awareness was a secondary event to the decision.
You mean a lagged event? Yeah. So that's a funny thing. This is
It's more
also
that the awareness is also the reaction. So that's because there's something that happens, but then once the awareness has already happened, then biologically you've already reacted. So that's
right.
I think that's the argument there.
Right, but you've already acted to program it into your brain. You consciously chose to do that, right?
No, it's well, this is in regardless of what, like in that, for the finger wagging thing, yeah, you can say they were primed. But then I think I'm familiar with, I think the study John was referencing, but I can't remember what it was either. But it's more applicable to just a more life, like throughout your entire life kind of thing. Like things will be happening to you, but then it's the idea that your awareness or the idea that you're making choices Sam's argument isn't so much that it's predetermined, but it's more that you don't have the control that you think you have, which is that.
I do agree with that. I agree that choice is far narrower than we would ever wish to accept. Most free will people, I think it's extraordinarily narrow and difficult to make actual choices.
Well, there's a difference here then between there was the idea of what free will, and then what's the other one? Because this was a previous discussion that we had when it was actually on consciousness. Sorry, what?
Compatibilism.
No, it was free will, I think, versus like destiny or fate kind of thing.
Oh, fatalism?
Yeah, so those ones. But we need to tie this back to God somehow, because otherwise it seems to be a really big tangent. So it's the reason why we're talking about consciousness is because it was a tangent of that for some people, God is the unknown. So it seems then like, but I would still say for only some people, that's what God is. Because for other people, like I wouldn't say for Peterson, Peterson's definition is God is the unknown. But I would understand that for the traditional conservative who, by their big five, they're low on openness. So therefore, there's a lot they don't particularly comprehend or care to comprehend. They're more willing to trust and be loyal to what they already believe society has determined to be correct. Then for them, it's like, I don't know about it, but I can kind of feel it's true or sense that is true through some intuition, be it a rationality or feeling or whatever it is. But then, so therefore they're more willing to accept their own humility and then delegate it to this unknown. So therefore God can be this unknown. And then it's like this placeholder. But it's still like this, it's not really a systematic, like you could probably then still say, I think it's quite different definition than both Peterson and Sam are using. Like it seems for some people, God is the unknown, but I wouldn't say it's a lot of people.
Well, we're going over various perspectives, let's say, of how to view God, and there's my way of viewing God, right? And there are, say, more or less qualified ways of seeing God. That's kind of partly what we're discussing is the historical narrative of how we've seen God, right? So you can go back as far as you like, and earliest depictions of God were those minuscule single-powered gods, right? The anthropomorphic deities of the wind blowing through the forest or the lightning bolt. But now our conception of God has changed dramatically. No one who believes in God, I think, is completely, who also believes in these other descriptive, explanatory systems, let's say, can place God at any particular level. It has to be at some particular level, right? So nobody places God in the lightning bolt, let's say, if they also have a detailed understanding of electromagnetism and how static electricity builds up, and inductive discharge and all these various
unless
things.
they're a pantheist, right? Which is then that the just like ourselves or the lightning bolt, those are also gods. So it's like this idea that it's similar to, I think it's the what is it, the one that comes after, like the successor to the Gaia theory. So Gaia theory is, more that the only place that exists is Earth, right? So then Earth is a god, and it's like a living creature, and it's also this all-powerful one, and then it controls all the weather and things like that. But then, with the discovery that, okay, Earth is just a part of the universe, then it seems Gaia theory then transformed more into pantheism, which is then there's this, what one considers to be this great unknown or this entity can then be anthropomorphized into actually everything that we see and everything that we are. So we're also a part of it. The lightning is a part of it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that makes sense with Sam Harris's perspective of there not being a self, but he can't deny that there's will within like his own actions and within other people's actions. But the will he's not labeling as his own will, but as kind of the will of, let's say, the body that he resides within. So
yeah, but what does that mean, man?
Well, so the idea is
going back to that the memes are controlling me nonsense, right?
From Susan Blackmore.
Well, Sam's big test for that is, imagine a flock of pigeons, and then the idea is, well, what breed of pigeons did you imagine, and then how many did you imagine, and that wasn't consciously decided by you. So whatever is controlling that force, you have no control over. And if you're going to have control over the unconscious that then brings things out from the ether, then what will do you actually have besides the illusion that you have it?
No, mm-hmm. So here's what I think it is. Consciousness seems to be like it's mimicking the type of electrical activity that occurs in our brain. So there's a build-up phase, right, where like everything that's tied to a particular choice or a moment in choice space is called upon, right? And there's a particular reason why you have lag time or conceptual lagging between ideas and call and recall and all that, because it's related to the amount of time it takes for the conscious experience to assemble the pieces. Now, what's really interesting about the conscious experience is that it's highly attuned to differences in wavelength, let's say, right? So if you're watching a particular set of colors, you'll notice, very quickly when something is different, right? If it's from a steady color to any minor configurations, as long as it's within your mechanical ability to see it, right? But we have this very specialized orientation reflex to anything that is anomalous. We're highly attuned to it, right? But here's what's also interesting about it is if you watch any particular signal for a given period of time, your brain will tune it out. It gets used to it, right? So I think what it is when we're awake, what we're used to seeing, what we're used to paying attention to predominantly as the conscious experience is the high energy, constant sensory experience of the things that are, most meaningful. And that's our gaze, our vision, coupled with our sound, hearing, right? And then the proprioception of the rest of our nerves distributed throughout our bodies to varying degrees, depending on your, physical makeup. But that seems to be what you can pay attention to. Now, if you stop paying attention to those signals, weird things start to happen, right? Weird changes start to happen to your conscious experience in the way that you view the wavelengths coming in. But to say that you made a choice, like to wag your finger and then experience the felt perception of that awareness afterwards, is just simply like, you can think of it as like the roots of a tree leading up to a trunk, all that root structure distributed out underneath. And if each one of them at the very tip, all the way out, like 5, 10 feet, 20 feet underground, and this giant cloud of roots underneath started a charge buildup phase, let's say, and then sent a signal up each one of those roots. These are the dendrites of the neurons. At some point, they collectivize into a signal that's coherent enough for our ordinary awareness to pay attention to it and to manipulate it, right?
But the immediate answer to that is, so what? Like, because that's the only thing that I can have to that, which is, well, what does it matter? I don't particularly consider it useful from any practical standpoint. It's just like another argument about, well, do the programs of our computers, like, we can make the same argument about the electrons moving through the intelligence of an artificial intelligence, right? Like through the circuitry of an artificial intelligence, and can consider that to be amazing. And we can have debates about consciousness of AIs, or even computers or smartphones, or even a plant kind of thing. Like none of this.
Wait. Do you and I both agree that we're having a conscious experience?
That's
what we're talking about here.
Well, no, but the point here is that the idea is, okay, well, we have certain terms, right? But so the term right now is, we can then say, okay, well, we're conscious. So we're conscious when we're awake, and we're unconscious when we're sleeping. And dreams are driven by our unconscious. But the thing is that it's a line of argumentation that just jumps off a cliff and keeps going, which is the question of what is consciousness doesn't seem to be anything that is worthy of philosophy currently, at least in my opinion. It's just waiting until we know more.
Here's the chain of argument that we just went about. Whether we're talking about description of God, we're talking about how that initially developed historically, which seems tied to the intent of things, right? That developed over time into the type of God that we explain now, right? So, and then we talked about consciousness and willpower with regards to Sam Harris and how he perceives whether or not free will exists. And that's where we are now. We're talking about the potential existence of free will and consciousness, and why that's important in our description of God. That's why it matters.
I still don't understand the connection of why perceptions of consciousness matters to the conception of God, because no matter whether or not we have free will or not, we still exist either way, and we still have to act either way, and we still perceive we have will either way. So it's just like, it's a non sequitur type of argument. Like, it doesn't go anywhere. So either way, we still have to say, well, what is God, regardless of consciousness?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but consciousness is a big part of whether or not God has that attribute, right? That is a big question of how we're defining God, is consciousness and choice and intent, right? We are trying to discuss the various ways in which we can see God, and the way that Harris sees it and the way that Peterson sees it.
Sure. So I would say the way Sam sees it is purely as the man in this, like, the person which, as the entity that the religions believed in, right? And whether it's literally or metaphysically, then it's still just a entity that can be thrown away with. So it's like, when it's the transgression between transition between who is God to then be, well, what is God? So then, well, who is God? Well, it's always changed. It's been this mythological figure. And when we stop believing in religion, then we consider it to be a myth or a fairy tale. But then, so we have, Yahweh, or we have Zeus kind of thing. And Sam makes that comparison a lot, to then say, well, why do we consider Jehovah or Yahweh or the Christian God to be in the same category as Zeus? And therefore it's this entity that then represents this way of operating in the world, which we can then adopt a way of operating without the supernatural belief, without a belief in the supernatural entity. So it's really like this video game character type entity. But when Peterson's one is, well, it's not an entity at all. It's a psychological tool of what is an ideal that then defines the rules of how we act in the world. And so, you know, for Peterson, atheism doesn't exist because either way, you need a God in terms of an ideal of how to set the rules on how to act. And then that's where the disagreement between Peterson and Sam keeps happening. And then Sam would then say, well, why use the word God? And then Peterson would be like, it's the word we've used for the same phenomena for ever since our existence. And then he would probably retaliate, well, it's Sam that's actually trying to use new technology that we've never used before and new ways of thinking about the issue of God that we've never used before. And then it's the same thing with like Nietzsche or with like Nietzsche, where he's like, okay, well, eventually it's going to be hard to believe in the supernatural with the development of science. So that's going to limit people's ability to believe in the supernatural entities. So the supernatural God or the entity God. So therefore, that's going to leave a gap. But then, and then he predicted then people would move to ideologies or to, you know, and then that would, or even to just worshipping men. So we see with Peterson in one of his lectures, he showed like the imagery that Hitler as well as Stalin used. And then they were like God-like imagery, like they represented a lot of the artwork that would portray God, but in a similar style, similar art form. So then there was a lot of man worshipping at the same time. In the same way we kind of worship sport teams, which is worshipping is also generally a word associated with God. But then that's where Peterson also then considers Sam to not do it enough seriousness because, well, Sam would then view it, I guess, good if people still moved away from God to ideology. But then Peterson will then obviously say, well, that's really bad because they've just changed the God. They've changed it from the Christian God to the feminism God or the Marxism God or the Nazi God or the Soviet Russia God or the communistic God, or, you know, so those are ideological gods, which can commit a lot more atrocity because when you commit crimes, there's no longer this dissonance anymore because then with the ideology, it actually defines, like with whatever you perceive to be your God, it then defines what is good and what is evil. So then, and that's the danger of it. And that's also then, yeah. So maybe we can at least pause with at least that, and then maybe take that a bit more because, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just reminded of our conversation back on morality, how within whichever framework that you're working within, say with capitalism, when you're acting within a capitalistic framework, the highest value is the most amount of capital. So when you're within an ideology of, say, power, then the highest value is that which has the most amount of power, or something like that. Or if you're, yeah, sorry.
Oh, it's exactly right. It's exactly right.
Yeah, I think we should go over, Peterson's conception of God, because he's not, it's very different from Harris's, who, like we'd mentioned, it seems to be primarily concerned with the fictional character of God. And that seems to be like the limits of at least what he's talked about his whenever he references God, like and any of the arguments for God, he's always taking as being arguments for Jehovah or the character of Jehovah within the Bible, and not considering God as something outside of the text of the Bible, which perhaps Peterson does, or
Well, even if Sam did consider it that way, he still would then have to prove the argument that we can choose our own story regardless of God. So there was that Sam was just on Rubin Report, and where he debated, where he talked about Peterson and Peterson's belief in God and things like that. But with because Sam essentially makes two claims, and one is there's no reason to believe in these mythological creatures or entities. We should throw away with that, and we don't need to derive our morality based on these stories. So he views them as like fairy tales, and fairy tale entities, just like Zeus has now been relegated to be. And then we don't need to derive our morality from Zeus anymore. So why do we need to derive it from Jehovah or the Christian God? But then it's fair enough, and we can use science to answer a lot of questions about how to live better. We to give Sam credit on his own arguments, he then denounces Islam because we can objectively measure from the ideas that we define well-being, or through history, then we can say, well, it's horrible. And then so through the moral landscape, there's different tribes, and then some tribes we can denounce, and then some tribes do a little bit better. But then within those tribes, they could still consider it good. But it's kind of like this belief that we will eventually develop a universal morality, or a morality that we can all come to understand. But then it seems from that, it's hard to take that somewhere, because okay, maybe there's three claims then. We don't need to believe in fairy tale entities. We don't need to derive our morality from fairy tales, and we can derive a universal morality. Those seem to be, I guess, his three claims. But then the big question there is, well, what's your proof that we can? Well, I guess it's true if you view them as fairy tales, right? Like if you view them as within that framework, like the atheistic framework, then yes, you can, or the atheistic perspective. But then there's a difference, again, with the idea, and I think we covered this in a previous episode as well, where we talked, well, there's a difference between a god and a deity. So Sam, I don't think, sees any distinguishment between God and deity, when Peterson would then say, well, deity is Zeus, but God is the rule maker and the ideal. So Peterson often says, like, for a meth addict, meth is their God. But obviously meth isn't a deity. So yeah, it's then the different ways of categorizing. But for Sam's claims, then fair enough, they're all true, right? But then to what extent are they true? And then the only extent which they're true is they allow you to, is in the relegation of religion. They're not also true in the way that God is a rule maker rather than just a deity. So because Sam's arguments completely fall away when you have ideology, because they just lead you to another type of religion instead. You move, like, not a religion that believes in a deity, but a religion that believes in Hitler, or believes in Stalin, or believes in Lacey Green at the time, or whatever it is. Or even like for the alt-right, like the left would view it as the religion that believes in Trump, right? So we can use those terms. So we can say like cult leader and things like that, or cult. So those type of, that's the shortcoming of Sam's three claims, I guess, or the extent of which they're true.
I'd argue against the second claim that you don't require these stories in order to derive morality. I think morality is a byproduct of stories, and you can't reason your way to morality without using story to meme it to someone else. So even within Sam Harris, he uses the conception of the greatest possible world of well-being and the worst possible world of well-being. These are both fictions that he's creating in order to prove his point about why it's best to go towards this greatest possible world of well-being and away from the worst possible world. It's pretty much the same as Christians talking about trying to guide your actions towards attaining heaven instead of going towards hell. But Harris just uses these two different words, two different ideas, still with the acknowledgement that they're fiction. Whereas within Christianity, the ideas of heaven and hell are very much literal. And even, I don't know, in order for you to share your moral intuitions or your moral framework with somebody else, you have to have some sort of story that allows them to comprehend it and understand it. So Jonathan Rawls, he was a liberal philosopher, and his story was, or not real story, but his way of helping people to empathize for the people that are poor, it was to conceptualize prior to birth, you were hovering above where you were going to be born. And it's a random crapshoot for where you're going to be born. And so you want to set up your society so that no matter where you're born within that society, it's a household that you'd be comfortable with growing up within. It's a fiction that he's creating in order to sell basically his moral framework to other people. And I think through Peterson, he's making the case that the Bible is a collection of these stories that could have been brought about from a multitude of actual historical events kind of meshed together, or singular historical events that have been embellished, or even just poetic events that have just been created, that all have made attempts at telling a story for the readers of the story and the focusers to have a moral development within their own character, so that they have an intuition for what should be done in action for the world.
Yeah. So it's I think that's your personal your disagreement with Sam's point. I think that Sam believes that point. I wouldn't say, did you disagree that that was his argument, or do you disagree with the argument?
Well, it's the trying to get rid of story. I mean, no matter what you do, if you're going to try to create a moral system, you need some sort of story behind it.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a disagreement to the argument rather than disagreement that's his argument, because that second claim was definitely that we don't need to derive our morality from deities, pretty much, or from religion. And the religion that he sees is the one of deities, where heaven is a literal place in the sky and hell is a place in the earth. But then, to define, and then then ties into how Peterson says, well, atheists don't act as if they're atheists, because for Sam to even talk about heaven and hell, he's using the exact same way people act about the literal heaven and hell. all he's doing, but then so the symbolism of the words perhaps is different, right? The way we incarnate these words into our brain, our imagery, but the way that we use them is still the same. So the way that, the way he uses the best possible outcome, the worst possible outcome, the best possible universal outcome and the worst possible universal outcome. It's just heaven and hell. It's just different words, but for the same purpose. And then the other argument Sam has is that, there is another one. So it'll probably be 4 claims, which is the other argument is a lot of horrific things have happened in the name of religious belief. So, that could be the idea of maybe circumcision, or it could be like a way of, maybe we need to sacrifice children to, burn children alive or something like that as the quality of our sacrifice to God. So these things, when you use it like that, well, yeah, the actions there don't align with the way that we then use heaven and hell or good and evil now. So there is a bit of different actions, but then it doesn't concede either point. It doesn't prove either argument, because it's like, yeah, bad things were done, but so what? You can do bad things even in the name of no religion. But the idea is, well, you can move into like an atheism 2.0 or, the Peterson type of thing, where you take, the mythology or the way of acting, like the symbolism or the archetypes, like Peterson talks about the idea of memes and archetypes, where, well, atheism can't just be about the claims of, abandoning deities and abandoning rules made by deities, and then abandoning the bad things that were done by deities, and then finding the good things on your own. Because it doesn't address meaning at all. It doesn't address at all the ought, like Hume's ought versus is problem. You still need to somehow define what is good, and how you define that is largely subjective. But there is ways to make it more objective. There is ways to influence that subjectivity. So you can have something that is universally subjective when everyone believes eventually in something, but it doesn't mean that it's subjectively true. So then for that, and that's the way, like truth seems to always be subjective because it's always getting revised. So when we say about an objective truth, all it really means is, well, objective then means without an observer. But then when we consider moral truths, well, they generally always need an observer because they're casting a judgment. So therefore, they can only be subjective and universal. They can't really be objective. So in terms of that, all of Sam's things, they don't address the meaning issue. And then the meaning issue is then the area which religion has always been the thing that is addressed. So, but you can revise, like take out, the systems of religion that are secular, that are atheistic, you could say, like without deity, but still take the systems, which is exactly what Peterson or Nietzsche have been doing, or same with Jung, it seems as well, which is a big influencer of Peterson, which is, well, what do the ways people interact with this mythology actually mean? What is the truth behind them?
Yeah, and it's a different truth from how, like, Harris conceptualizes truth, which is something that is like something that can be tested, like, yeah, a scientific truth. This is a moral truth that is derived over practice.
Also, Tyler, I hope I didn't steal your tongue when I interjected. Is he still there?
Maybe he fell asleep.
Maybe. It's pretty late for him. Or maybe it's just attending to the kids or something. That's fine.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. But we shouldn't get into the truth debate.
Yeah. Well, we covered that in a previous debate, so we don't really need to.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Yeah. So okay. So if I go through the notes,
I wanted to read back a AMA response that Peterson did about a year ago or so. Hello, Dr. Peterson. How would you define your God? I don't know why I put quotes there. Do you believe in the supernatural? Do you pray? Thank you. His response. My God is the spirit that is trying to elevate being, capital B. My God is the spirit that makes everything come together. My God is the spirit that makes order out of chaos and then recasts order when it has become too limiting. My God is the spirit of truth incarnate. None of that is supernatural. It is instead what is most real. It depends on what you mean by pray. I don't ask God for favors, if that's what you mean. And then I think... go ahead.
Sorry. It's so baffling to me because that is exactly Rand's God, like word by word. And yet it's so strange that like, you know, like Howard Rourke, like the whole thing about why he was an architect was he took from chaos and ordered it, right? And then the Atlas Shrugged was all about truth, and like Rourke was the embodiment of his truth, but Atlas Shrugged is also the pursuit of truth, right? And it's so weird that like Peterson doesn't like Rand, but I think it's a personality difference. Because, you know, taste is subjective, and Peterson has admitted he is higher on agreeableness. So when fans' audience seems to be the low agreeableness types, the very libertarian audience.
Well, there was that one like video that he had where he was reading something from Ayn Rand, and he was tearing up and as he was trying to read through it. I don't remember if it was from her. I think it was something about the power of the individual. So it was probably something from her actual philosophy than one of the books. But it's hard to really, if his favorite author is like Dostoevsky, it's hard to really see how Ayn Rand's books are similar to Dostoevsky. So it could be. I think it's probably. I mean, being a psychologist, the characters within Dostoevsky have a lot more confusion about them. They're more like puzzles to have to work through. Whereas with Rand, it's not really the puzzles of the characters. It's just seeing how they interact with each other. That is the drama.
Yeah, it is. Well, yeah, that's Atlas Shrugged is a very different book, but yeah, I mean, yeah, it's probably like a side note in terms of the differences. Yeah. But it is just really strange though, because it is the exact same God. Because we have right here in the show notes, right, like for Rand. So okay, well, what is her ideal? Actually, maybe we can cover that a bit later. Oh, no, we'll just do it right now. So, well, what is Rand's ideal? Well, let's say her spirit, it's reason, which is always check your suppositions, like truth. And she lived that in her life. Like people who lied to her, she cut them out instantly. She never understood lying. She viewed as one of the most horrific things anyone could actually do because it violated, you know, your own oath to your spirit, I guess. And then, yeah, idols would then be prime movers versus the second handers. So, you know, who's the idol and then who's the devil?
Okay, idol as in IDOL or IDLE?
IDOL.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. And then God. So what is the thing that's actually worshipped? And then it would be like man's creative spirit. So, you know, like she worshipped mankind. And was so, well, what is mankind? And I think a few times, like she would liken the person who doesn't create is more of an animal than a human. Where it's like, you know, for the second hander, it's kind of like bottom feeder a little bit, right? Or they're like, yeah, she called like, you know, there was the creators, and then there was the other terminology she used was the prime movers were the creators, and then the second handers were the looters, the moochers, and the parasites. So they were a lot more animalistic because they didn't embolden the spirits of what makes man the unique creature that they are.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily worship of all of mankind. It's the worship of the best aspects of mankind.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so that's for her God, but then she also presented her moral philosophy, right? So, well, that's, you know, her God, but then why is that God better? And then this is when it's like some people consider Rand to be like one of the best moral philosophers there is, because like with her objectivism, she worked to prove her moral philosophy. So then with her, like, so yeah, okay, you believe in that God, and then, you know, Christians believe in their God, and these other ones believe in their God. But then how do you actually then qualify that? How do you then say, well, Rand's God, or, you know, what Peterson's God there is actually better? And that's what Peterson spent 12 rules of life doing. He's spent his 12 rules of life to try and quantify or qualify why those rules produce a better outcome, like why these rules are holy, why these rules are worth being associated with the word God, or to that ideal. And like the truth one, like he goes into absolute detail about why truth is fundamentally better for well-being, right? Mm-hmm. And like so that's part where it's kind of trying to, that's when, yeah, you then have the, well, how do you comparatively compare different gods? And then for Rand, the way that, and I haven't found anything to really counter this unless you value different things, which is for Rand, her whole thing is about selfishness and cynicism. So then it's like, well, let's think about cynicism. It's not the type of cynicism that Conan O'Brien, Conan from the Late Night Show talked about on his Leaving show. Like that type of cynicism is treating people like shit because you think they're out to get you. But there's the cynicism where if you understand that, if you believe that you're driven by your self-interest, or that everyone is driven, if you believe everyone is driven by self-interest, then it means you're driven by self-interest. But then it also means everyone else is. So therefore, for you to get what you want, you then need to provide what other people want. So for you to be able to cooperate with other people, you need to give them a bit of what they want too. And her tenets, I guess, like her golden rules, like the way of actually knowing that you're acting this, is she says, yeah, like always check your suppositions when something unexpected happens, because reality never lies. And then the other one is, if others live for you, her one is from John Galt. He says, I will never live for another man, and I request no other man lives for me. And so for that, well, it's easy to know why the line of reasoning for that is very simple, which is it's a way of opting out of abuse. Because if others live for you, then you can tyrannize them. It can be abused. And if you live for others, then you can tyrannize yourself, because you would then be lying to yourself perhaps about your reality. Unless you were 100% loyal and it didn't matter what you did, then you would probably have to lie to yourself to live for someone else. And others can also tyrannize you. So for her thing, for like, you see this all the time with relationships, like, you know, one partner would sacrifice themselves for the other, and then the relationship fails, they discover something about that, and it becomes so resentful. It's just like, I gave my whole life to you and blah, 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 blah. And they feel like they wasted the life, and, you know, they gave everything for nothing. And that type of abuse that they were then susceptible from, that is not possible following Rand's philosophy. In Rand's philosophy, if two people really did what she says, then there is no option for abuse, because all along the way, it's mutual and it's self-serving from both parties. So there's no option for them to neglect each other, but it's still built on truth. You know, if someone lies, then that would be a violation of the philosophy, because then lying is deliberately going against someone else's self-interest for your own, which then I think is a lot of misconception about Rand, because she also ties it with, you must always check your suppositions if something unexpected happens, because you shouldn't be violating. Well, yeah, I think I think at least for what I've said there, it's true. To speculate, to take that further, then I'm going to go into a bit that I'm not particularly that qualified right now. So
I'm always, maybe I need to actually read some of her philosophical books just to understand what self-interest actually means. Because, I mean, I understand it's within like your own self-interest over time, but I wonder how far does that actually go? Because like that quote you were saying where I will never live my life for another man and I will expect them not to do the same for me. How do you reconcile that with having a child? Do you do you still place your own self-interest above the interests of the child, or like the extended interests of the child, or?
Well, the point is that you know, you should be, well, children, you know, they can also be accidental. They can be, well, I shouldn't say, yeah, maybe accidental. Unexpected is the better word I was going for, right? In which case, then you end up with a horrible situation. But then the idea is, well, you should have hopefully had some more intent there. But that's besides my point, which is, you know, for your interaction with the child, then it needs to be something where you probably, yeah, you need to act like, if I talk personally, right? Like I have a great joy in being a father for the time I was a stepfather, right? You know, the kids at times were annoying as hell, right? And at times I kind of question that kind of thing. But it's the idea of what needs to also serve yourself. You can't just become a martyr for them. Because otherwise you will poison the relationship, like you'll poison the situation. It's kind of like the same thing for Peterson's truth chapter, where if you lie to yourself, then eventually you poison everything. So the idea is, well, you need to get some benefit out of it. And if you're not, then you're lying to yourself and you're just making things worse. So, and I think maybe like intuitively, this is probably why like some people who were adopted, they respect their foster parents incredibly. They don't, and they kind of like, I think generally they have this idea that it's better that I was raised by parents who wanted me, the foster parents or the adoptive parents, compared to the biological parents who didn't. So then it's the idea of at least that's a better outcome. And it seems to be true in those situations. But for me, it's hard because I have such a strong, you know, loyalty is so incredibly high for me, which is really strange that, you know, I would probably be the shitty dad who always tried, I guess. At least that's my imagery. Maybe in reality it's going to be different, right? But then for me, then at least then that's, well, you know, you're at least there. So like that would still be satisfying that need. So it's like, but, you know, if I didn't have that, like, so for me, it's like, yeah, like slaving away at a job. Like, so if I was to have an accidental, you know, pregnancy with my partner, and then she was to have a kid, it's like, well, there goes my my entrepreneurship. Time to just get a you know, a normal job and, you know, maybe an Uber on the side or whatever it is, right? Like, do everything you can to protect that kid, and that's when, okay, well, you're sacrificing your happiness, but you're gaining meaning if you have that loyalty, right? Like, if that serves your purpose, because otherwise, you know, you will probably end up shooting yourself or the kids as well, or just buggering off, or just being like this shit abusive dad that the child no longer respects. So it seems, you know, it does seem like it's something that it's been observed where it is a better outcome from Peterson with the truth chapter, as well as Rand's selfishness. It's just like they seem to be just using different frameworks of coming to the same conclusion.
Yeah. I mean, it's that high sense for truth as being that which is good is kind of the tying in between Christianity and the Logos and Rand's philosophy. And it's surprising because it's the truth is also one of the highest values of, say, the new atheists, but from what I understand it, there's no way to. Well, I don't know. Maybe there is. Never mind. Sorry. That's the tying in. That's the kind of shared God between the three philosophies. It is the desire for truth to be widespread. But truth itself is not a physical thing that you can have. It's kind of a metaphysical proper, or not metaphysical, but just it's the abstracted. Yeah, because you can have abstracted conceptions of reality, and then you can have those abstracted conceptions of reality that align with reality and is like a model that is functional within reality for how to determine what reality is, and that's what's classified as truth. But between having a conception of reality and then a different conception of reality that actually is functional, it's the functionality, or at least one aspect of the functionality. No, what am I saying? That's the difference between these two different like ideas we have about reality. One of them's true, one of them's not, but they're both made of the same kind of material. Just one of them actually works in practice, which is what makes it great.
Yeah, we've also, from our viewers, I've got the chat up as well, and Michael has said Rand was livid on government handout later in her life, but there are still priorities. Oh, sorry, Rand lived. Right, so I guess it's Rand lived on government handout later in her life, so that was true, and that was.
That's the common argument against Rand, but she has a rationale behind it because she was forced to pay for welfare through her taxes, so it's within her self-interest to benefit from the money that was stolen from her, so that, at least she got it back in some way. That's rationale that's used for her living off of welfare towards the end of her life.
Yeah, you can still criticize something while still engaging in it as well, and that doesn't necessarily make you. Maybe it can be viewed as hypocritical, but hypocritical seems to be like a word that's easily thrown around. And there was a good video I think I saw once on what hypocritical was, but it's just like say it's the same thing. Like if you view both parties as shit. Like political parties say, are your options for voting, I would then still think that you have an obligation to still vote for the lesser one while you still work on reforming the entire government system. Like you could be a libertarian, but then it's just like, well, if your candidate gets opted out or your best candidate, then you still have to pick for the lesser of two evils. And it's kind of the same thing with operating, like say in Australia. Like I'm fairly libertarian, and in the time that I was in Australia, they took my income tax, right? And well, that sucks because I don't believe in taxation at all. But while I'm in Australia, I need to consent to the laws that Australia has, otherwise they can't opt to leave. But I have to work within my means of changing the system or leaving the system. I can't just then be like, well, this is ridiculous and not accomplish anything. And maybe like you can as like a way of saying truth, but then you always have to think, well, what good does it do? And it's the same thing with the vegan argument, which is, well, if vegans only cared about not inducing harm, then they would be Jains, or they would live as tribal people in Papua New Guinea or nomads in Mongolia, like which are the ways of reducing your harm as much as possible, but they also reduce your output. So the vegan separates from Jains, it seems, in terms of the way that they then just wish to reduce the harm, have a balance where their contribution to reducing harm is less than their actual harm caused. And then that would then be the same with any libertarian that exists that isn't in a jail, which is that they view the contribution that they do to achieve libertarian principles as more than the ways that they have, what would you call it, not accomplish those principles or have to subside in that system. And Shapiro argues this as well, which is when it comes to your university papers, write as if you're Karl Marx himself, right? But then as soon as you get out, become a lawyer and then buy the university and change it, right? So, yeah, so, yeah, and I think...
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
There is a bit of this, which is, I would still view it, I guess, very similar to the vegan argument, right? Which is like, for myself, I'm personally vegan. And then for me, I would never go out of my way to hurt or induce harm knowingly, where I view that the cost was unnecessary. But then if let's say I develop a disease where I can no longer digest plant protein or whatever it is, I can only digest animal protein and it can't particularly be synthesized. Like I can't grow the meat in a lab or whatever it is, then fine. Like I would induce more harm to myself. And considering Rand was at her later of life and she was livid as well to live on welfare, and it was kind of thrown upon her by her family and her supporters and things like that, then that was another reluctance. In the same way Steve Jobs had the same reluctance, where he was told by all his doctors and everything he had to violate his vegan principles and consume meat to try and deal with his cancer, which in hindsight seemed to have been a terrible idea. Considering the new research that has developed since then. So, yeah.
Well, the big antithesis to objectivism, or actually you could consider objectivism as the antithesis to this, is Christianity, with the central ethic of Christ being somebody that gave up his life for everyone else besides him. It's the in John 15:13, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. That's like the complete opposite of what objectivism is about, with working towards your own self-interest. And
well, there's also like the is my voice crackling like at all, like from the bandwidth?
Sounds fine. It might be mine.
Yeah, your voice is crackling a bit, so I was trying to figure out whether it's mine or yours. So you have I think, was it Aristotle or Plato who had to poison themselves?
That was Socrates.
Socrates, right. So say for that instance, like situation, because you can then say, well, okay, Steve Jobs was a hypocrite. All the vegans are hypocrites. All the, like say Ayn Rand was a hypocrite, right? And they all violated the truth chapter of Peterson. Like these are simple claims to make, I guess. And to some extent, they're certainly true. But then it's just like, well, are they true from entirely true? And then I would say, well, there's a difference with like Jobs or with Rand or with, vegans kind of thing, which is they'll partake in their belief and they will reduce the dissonance. So it's like, okay, I will consume in this or partake in this action because I view my ability, to use this action to contribute to the reduction of this violation to be a better outcome. So therefore, they have an ideology to then reduce their dissonance. There's no dissonance there. But they also continue their evangelism. That's why it doesn't violate the truth part of the Peterson's 12 rules. Because let's say, they got a payoff, right? And then they weren't allowed to talk about an issue or whatever it is. And that's probably like, that was a situation with Soviet Russia, with the people being arrested, which was that, a lot of them then went through with the arresting and and then also committed to crime, admitted to crimes they didn't commit because they were terrified about their family being implicated. And this is why like torture and things don't work. But then would that violate the truth argument? And it seems maybe that would, maybe, but I mean, these are hard questions, but it seems like that would, because say in Maps of Meaning, they talked about people who, once they did do that violation, no, Maps of Meaning, in Man's Search for Meaning, the people who did do such violations, then they just became a shell of a person afterwards. They couldn't resolve that dissonance, and they may have even chosen suicide or just to wither away. When the ones who stood up was...
What types of lies were they telling? Like self-protective lies?
Yeah, well, it would be ones to protect their families, or it could be like admitting to crimes even if they didn't have families. It could be the idea of admitting to crimes they didn't commit. Well, I think I could be confusing Man's Search for Meaning and the
Gulag.
The other one, yeah, Gulag, because Man's Search for Meaning, there wasn't really any desire to incriminate people. When Gulag Archipelago was all about the Soviet Russia, was all about how the government is pure and God like, and everything that they did was holy. Where, you know, for anyone to be arrested, then it had to be done legally, and the people had to affirm that they did do the crimes. Like everyone had to sign papers to go to jail, and they would get tortured until they signed the papers. But then they would also have to sign papers to say the torture was in accordance of humanitarian laws and everything. So, right? So like in accordance with the ideals. And that's why like Solzhenitsyn then says, yeah, like after they won the war with the Germans, they then had a war within Russia to purge all the betrayers, right? Like to purge all the people who spoke against Russia, kind of thing. Like so then, you know, they always wanted to be, yeah, it's quite, yeah, always wanted to have this purity, but it's like, yeah, the idea then that, and people did, but that's the thing, like people went along with it because they believed it. Like they replaced God of this external thing beyond man. And I think to some extent this is what Tyler has also said many times, where you know, God is the thing beyond man. It's the thing that there needs to be some type of reverence, because as soon as we can identify with God, where to the extent that we no longer feel there is some type of othering, then we can make very bad decisions quickly, because then it means we can do whatever we want. There is the Rand's check your suppositions is no longer on the card, because anything we say is holy. So that's like the risk there, which is, you know, anything that Soviet Russia did was holy, and the people continued to eat their own nation apart for, you know, because they really believed that the nation was holy. And it's not really. And then, yeah, so some people who then committed the crimes and they decided to, you know, they couldn't live with them, you know, who admitted to that they couldn't live. But most people, they just admitted to it. And then like Solzhenitsyn, he just signed whatever, you know, they gave him and things like that. But then his entire life was then, and a lot of the people who he worked with, then they were all about, once we get out, then we're going to be able to set things straight. So it's like there was like this transformation period where you lose all hope. Your entire world has been torn apart. You lose hope. And then you have to kind of recreate yourself. He calls it like a second birth the day you get arrested. So it's a time when you now have to recreate. And it's like, well, there's no good at all in lying. So, and that's the same. That's actually why I brought up the Man's Search for Meaning, which was the people who survived could still find meaning, despite everything being taken away from them. So, you know, in a system of complete oppression, they had to find internal meaning somehow. And that internal meaning could be, when I get out, I'm going to, you know, set this straight like Solzhenitsyn did. Or it could be like, when I, you know, hopefully when I get out, I'll, you know, have a garden or something like that, right? Like, so at least something to hold on to. but the ones who ended up giving up on something, but it's also hard, right? Because you would give up on the garden one quicker than you would on I will set this straight, because the garden one, it's just like a hope or a destination, I guess, rather than a something that can, like, it doesn't resolve, it doesn't do anything to resolve dissonance, because if things gets worse, then you will need to still define what is good and evil, and you will still end up suffering from dissonance with your actions that you portray and with the violations that are committed against you. But for, let's say, Solzhenitsyn, I keep butchering his name, then he, you know, for whatever happened to him, then it was worth the cost of being able to get this out. So for what it, like, there was a way of then resolving dissonance with what was occurring. So it's like he was able to find a God that then allowed him to, you know, have grace in those situations. And it's not a deity God at all by any means, but it's God from all the way people act towards the idea of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the big. Well, I don't know how. I mean, we think of it as being a very huge gap between a psychological significant God or a metaphysically real God that we then have the psychological interactions that we would have as if the God existed in reality. But can you have one without the other? Can you treat God as merely a metaphor in a way that, because it actually works when you interact with reality and with people around you? Can you hold to that belief without the supernatural axioms that follow or that are along with it?
Well, sure. I mean, like, I mean, that must be true, right? Because that's how there's able to be similarities between the religions, and that's how atheists can even act with the principles of good and on bad, right? Which is, there's and it's also the same argument Sam makes, right? Which is, we should be able to have, and it's, you know, what Nietzsche talked about as well, which is, you know, these deities evolve over time, and you know, and yet we can still continue similar patterns regardless of the deity. So is the deity even necessary, or is it even valid to believe in the deity? Can't we just believe in the modes of action instead? And it's just like, well, yeah. And I think like that wasn't clear like 300 years ago. But now it certainly is clear. But because, and as well, like, when you think about it, like, it would be absurd to then say, you know, everyone needs to believe in Zeus because that's the only way to find God. Like, we're instantly repulsed by this idea. Like, when Christians evangelize that way, and they'll be like, you're only saying that because you haven't found God yet. And like, people get like pissed off when people say things like that, because it just assumes this type of ignorance. Where it's like, what, just because I don't believe in Zeus, then I don't get to be a good person? What the hell are you talking about, right? Like, it's insulting to a very high degree. But and it's also so dodgy as well, because yeah, that was like a tool for evangelism. It was a tool for a lot of the things that the atheists cry out about, which is, you know, the evangelism that converted like all the you know, when the West evangelized Christianity through the world, then it was kind of like you know, converting people's practices to then this other God. But then it's just like, well, fair dinkum, because on the other side, you know, it was able to give them practices that then were able to then take transform their ways of being into ways that were better for the current world or the current climate they would now be injected towards. So it's just like, well, it doesn't matter whether or not, you know, you believed in your God in, let's say, island XYZ, right? And your God is a God that is vengeful, you know, every monsoon season, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's the one that teaches you, you know, not to care about material possessions. And then, you know, one that also cares for you plentifully from the ocean with seafood and coconuts and rain and things like that. So he's one that gives, but he's also one that takes. And he's one that shows you his power every single year. Right. And then, and he's also one where you don't particularly want to wear that much clothing because that can promote your ability for infections and can promote different issues. And there may not be enough clothing. So then you could view people who then wear clothing as, you know, absurd because it's not applicable for that particular environment. Let's say this island is on the equator, so it's hot, right?
Yeah. Yeah, your moral intuitions stemming from your environment. Yeah.
Yeah. So then if you were to take that person's God belief and like take that person with the God belief and then inject them into Iceland, right, or northern Canada, right, then their God will fail them miserably and they will die. It's like, and then that God then gets relegated to myth, right? That's the gods that have become myths are the gods that we that rule set. The rules that that god made no longer apply, so therefore we've delegated them to myth, like as a whole, or you know, from that deities. But you know, if it was, and then for that evangelism, like the best thing to do would be to take that person, like if they needed, like for whatever reason they had to be relocated, right? If they were relocated to Iceland, the best thing for that person would be to, you know, convince them that their God is no longer applicable. It is a myth. And the God now is one that is cruel through winter, but he rewards long-term planning. Right now, it's one that requires you to plant grains in the summer and hold them during the winter and all those things. When in the equator, you got food all year round. The only thing you have to do is just be resilient and withstand the horrors of monsoon season. When with the north, then you have to be very prepared against the winter. So then the best thing for these people is evangelism, to update the culture to one that wouldn't hurt them. And it's just like, well, that's a bit arrogant to say. How can you make that moral judgment? And it's just for the same reason Sam Harris says you can make moral judgments culturally and religiously, right? Like you can then say, well, that one's going to hurt that person. And then it's like, well, which principles can we live by? And then it's just like, well, it seems like, you know, to what extent is it evident that, you know, we value life over death, right? Or like, you know, it's better not to, like if someone was, you know, it's an innate ability of us as social animals to try and, you know, help those in need or help those who will suffer, like try and help them through. But if that person that said, no, I fucking want to die, then it's also within our nature to have some compassion, like through euthanasia, or, you know, if we try and convince them not to do it, and then maybe we end up saying, yeah, your life fucking sucks, go for euthanasia, but then maybe suicide's also an option. So, right? So, you know, there is ways, and that's like, you know, Sam Harris's, I think it was one of the points, you know, one of the claims he makes, and it's a true claim. But you're still left with this meaning thing, this meaning argument. And like consciousness, maybe there is some relation to that, like it poses some interesting questions. But it seems like the consciousness is more prevalent, the arguments of consciousness is more prevalent today from the necessity of discussing it in relation to AI, because to develop better AIs, we need better understandings of how our own brain works. And it's like a cyclic effect between understanding AI, understanding consciousness. well, better AI, better understanding consciousness kind of thing. And, you know, when we do create AIs, how the hell do we defend against them? Or even if we should defend against them, what forms should they take? How can we create things that actually serve us? So these things seem to be questions of that regard. But and then maybe then, yeah, there's some things to then say about, well, you know, who's going to be the god to the Terminator, or the you know, the Matrix type situations, or the Wall-E. Like once the singularity happens and you have the AI that pass the Turing test, who is there going to be their god, right? And then maybe, you know, that's an argument to have about consciousness, but it seems you can engage in that debate as an additional factor. It doesn't seem that it's directly necessary to define the claims that are at least being made by Peterson or Sam.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate, though, or not debate, but just a conversation to go through.
Yeah.
So going back to my question on whether just thinking about these metaphysical and moral truths as being purely psychological, just because they're useful in living in our own day-to-day lives, or thinking of them as literal kind of truths. Because I can definitely see that within a civilized society such as the West, that the ethics of, say, secular humanism and objectivism and I don't know, libertarian, or I don't know, a liberal ethics. These are ethics that work within the environment that we're in currently, because we're not faced with existential dangers at all.
Right.
We're living quite high on the horse. Within situations where it is not within your best interest to speak the truth, or to do what is right according to these ethics, because they go against there's the rationale behind doing these things because they benefit you and they benefit your family, things like that. In situations such as Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, it was directly against his own self-interests, at least for my consideration, to work on this book. I mean, he was doing it, and people died because of him writing his book. Like, what was it? His secretary, like, after he was released, the KGB were looking for the manuscript, and they found part of it with her, and they killed her. These are situations where self-interest, it isn't good enough. I don't know. And it makes me, like, if your reasons for believing in these metaphorical truths are because they'll benefit you, if you lose the end benefit, I see it as you lose the moral ethics that come along with it as well.
Yeah. It's hold up. I've got feedback from your microphone when I talk.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Yeah, it says, I mean, that's certainly interesting, right? Because so far, at least from what we've said about Rand, right? Like, if it's purely the selfishness and then the truth seeking, right? Then, well, yeah, if you are in a society then where lying is incorporated to the point where it is now true to lie as the way of getting ahead, and there isn't really any downturn, like it's the only way to actually get an upshot, then it's hard, because then it would be within your self-interest. But another part of at least her philosophy was, at least with the truth thing, then it's, you know, there's a respect for, you know, man's creative spirit. And it seems like, you know, her philosophy is more complicated than like the 4 lines that I have written down, 5 lines here. But it seems then, and the same thing for Peterson, where it'd be, there's also the humility aspect, right? Which is what Peterson talked about with one of his other rules, which is, yeah, like I think clean your room, or yeah, clean your room type argument, which is you need to also, you know, be humble. So it's like we went through the 12 rules, and you know, if you just followed 11, no matter which 11 they were, you could probably commit an atrocity. But you needed all 12, it seems. We couldn't find one where if you had all 12, then you would commit atrocities, because there was at least a humbleness at some point where before violence occurs, then there would be the idea of we should talk about it. But then again, so then those systems would, let's just then take 12 rules, because it's verbalized more succinctly than what Rand's novels have done, right? So if we take 12 rules, then it is I think my brain just rebooted. There's
yeah. Okay, so yeah, taking the 12 rules as kind of like your universal ethic for where you can, yeah, how to, yeah, a universal ethic for all these different scenarios, even within, say, like the Gulag Archipelago.
Yeah. So with the 12 rules, what I like, so they will be able to prevent, in my opinion, because this hasn't been openly discussed yet, but from what I can interpret is that they will be able to prevent preventable violence. They won't be able to prevent necessary violence. And this is a argument, I think there's probably a live stream. Oh no, it would be around November last year, so I don't think we were doing live streams then, but this was an argument we've had in the discussion group where I think I diverged from other people, where I said, well, there is times where violence is necessary. And my argument for that was scarcity, or, you know, for the liberal, it can also be out of compassion. So then it could be, you want, like the Nazis are coming into your home and you're hiding Jews, or, you know, you're German and the Russians are going to come in. So you may view it, need it, or, you know, you go back a few hundred years ago, and let's just say the Vikings or Genghis Khan was about to pillage your village, right? And then out of compassion, you may decide to kill your own children as a way of protecting them from the rape and the plunder and the torture that the victims would do. And, you know, that's, or you then have just normal tribal conflict, which is one tribe runs out of food and there's not enough food to share. So what do? So, you know, and those tribes are different morals. They worship different gods. Or they both worship gods that, like, not, there's, I mean, who starves, right? And that's a hard question to answer. And it's also something which, you know, they're trying to tackle with AI, like the trolley problem with the AI in cars, self-driving cars, which is, who do you kill when an accident is unavoidable? Like, do you kill the grandma? Do you kill an obese person? Do you kill a kid? You know, Titanic is sinking. Who gets to live? Who gets to die? Right? Is it going to be the men, and the women and the children live, which is overwhelmingly the case in such things? And biologically, then that seems to make sense. But, you know, well, which men should get to live and which men should perish, right? And then how do you quantify that? And Sam's also has an interesting argument here, which is, it doesn't matter, you know, the philosophy, I guess, where there's a lot of baggage around that, but no matter what happens, we still need to encode these decisions going forward in the world that we're building. We need to be able to code these things into algorithms, because as we delegate more and more responsibility from us to technology, we need to encode something into technology to represent our morality. So we now need to qualify it. And that qualification doesn't depend on deities. And then Peterson says, yeah, but it still depends. You know, it's then the word game, right? The God, you know, all these systems of God and things like that. And then Peterson would also then say, well, it depends on meaning. And I've never heard Sam, and I was really into Sam in like 2014, 15, 16, no, 2014 and 15, but I wasn't into him that much afterwards, like after I found Peterson. But in the time that I listened to Sam, it would be like every week I followed his podcast, whatever. He didn't talk about meaning that much. It didn't seem like it was on his radar. And I don't know how you can talk about like sort out the ought issue without sorting out the meaning issue. So we have the idea. So I think this can be a good way of posing like a interesting bit. And then I'm only going to be around for another 8 minutes, but then unless you have something else to add, we can probably just run through the whole show notes as a summary and then pin it off with the idea of calling versus meaning and ideals.
I just have, I guess, a further, I don't know, thing to think about at least. You can have a set of rules for people, like you can have the universal ethics for like the 12 rules for life that anybody can use in their own day-to-day life. But yeah, when people are cynical about rules made by people, there's because if a rule isn't actually going to work in your favor, then there's no point in following that rule. So like I always think about what is it that can allow somebody to die for a cause? Like what beliefs can they hold that makes that something that they can go through doing and to do it nobly? And I don't know, maybe you can maybe do it through a detachment from your physical body, such as like through Buddhism, or the kind of polar opposite of that is through, or maybe not polar opposite, but through the metaphysical belief in, say, an afterlife, or within like for Socrates, it was or I don't know, Socrates or Plato puppeting Socrates, it was the belief in pure goodness, that you're working towards this thing outside of nature that you're working towards and trying to accomplish. And so, of course, I don't know, with Plato too, there was the idea of the afterlife too. But
it's
it's tricky. I don't know. I don't know. There could be a secular way to develop it, but it could also be that within today's society, there's no more reason to die for anything. Like there's no more. Not reason, but it's like there's no longer that need. Like people don't need to be dying over things anymore. I mean, with wars that still happens though. But I mean, if we've hit that point where there's never going to be any wars anymore, then nobody needs to die for anything anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think that falls under it's still a moral judgment then. It's still like like the way need is being used there is like a values-based need. Because, and what you said then attests to values, which is one derives the meaning, it seems, largely from their values. And God is the system or the tool that is used to mediate morality through differing value systems. So when everyone believed in one religion, like when there was a dominant religion of a culture, then the liberals still had to believe in Christianity, and they were still in a society that forced them to believe. Okay, we've got a message from the group. I wish I was able to join the discussion this week because I find the topic very interesting. I've always been confused about what Peterson means by God. Yeah, that was from Nata, so that would be. I just pick up, but I listened to the rest of it later. All right, great, Nata. And,
it's funny because our previous conversations were kind of on different topics, but yeah, we'll probably talk about this more. Especially, I'm imagining it'll come up a couple times with the Sam Harris conversations later this month.
Yeah. So there's the idea here. So for the values, then values then define someone's, their personality, which seems to be genetic. It seems genetic is the starting stone, and then nurture then adds on top of it. And then that defines your outlook and largely your meaning. It's what you value is then probably defined by, there's a really strong correlation between meaning and value and personality. And maybe not correlation. Yeah, correlation is the right word, but there's some interconnection or interdependence between them. And then there's, so God. So then you have the progressive, let's say in Christian America, or just anywhere in any Christian nation. So the person who is temperamentally liberal, or so high on openness, low on conscientiousness, then they're not going to, like, they're always going to be butting heads with religion in the society. They're always going to be feeling like the outsider.
Unless they can use religion to make their points, like in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., where he was a preacher using the ethics within the Bible to make his case for the end of segregation.
And it seems so but this kind of like, and the terminology they would use is like repressive, right? Like where religion has been a repressive force on them. It wasn't necessarily oppressive. It didn't, lock them in a dungeon or as a general rule, right? But yeah, from the way that they chose to act, then it was a repressive force because it also guided the morality of the state. But then what happened is, like once the scientific revolution happened, then it now started becoming more acceptable for people to leave. So then the progressive was like, I don't need to be repressed anymore. I can be me, and they leave. So but then we have this, and this is one of the first as this happened, which is why, Nietzsche was able to predict the horrors that would also come that were unseen, it seems. But then again, there is debates on whether or not, we're more violent now or we're less violent now, because it does seem to be some extent where it's, we were more violent before, but then was that violence out of necessity, like starvation and needing to kill another tribe to eat, or was that when now it seems the last 200 years the battles have been more, there is scarcity involved, but there's also been more a ideological battle to it, where it's not necessarily been I will need to kill you to starve, but it's we need to or starve or but now it's also we need to have these wars because we need to assert that this way of future is better out of even compassionate aims. But then so then the progressive can leave now, and so it's an experiment that we're still finding out whether or not this is a good idea or not. But there's no denying then that God was the mediator. The tool of God was the mediator to keep the society homogenous amongst different temperaments, amongst different personalities. And now that we've exploded God, then that would also seem to be one of the reasons why there's polarization between personalities and political views, where people are now just voting the personalities completely well, not completely, but completely enough. So and then that's an interesting experiment. So we don't know how that's going to play out. But it's interesting, right? Because then, yeah, there is options for it to play out. I linked in the chat group, and I posted on one of the responses on the discussion forum at discuss.jordanbpeterson.community. My friend Eddie Azar, he gave a talk about BitNation at Blockchain Zoo in Bali, and he was talking about seasteading there and how the crypto community has been able to put a ton of finances and resources into the hands of libertarians. And now they're actually thinking of becoming a political force and actually trying to set up their own countries and nations or secede in existing countries. So, or with seasteading, it doesn't particularly have to be libertarian. You could have a liberal seastead and you can have a conservative seastead and actually experiment with different modes of governance. Or it's really then different modes of God, and really see which ones are the ones that sustain. But there's now a turning point where we really need to reinvent our rules, and it's either maybe we've just had the clash of maybe like the five biggest gods in the world battle it out over the last 200 years, right? And now there's two predominant gods still battling. And then there's the man-made god of communism battling it out. So it's interesting.
What do you mean? The two main gods battling.
Yeah, so Christian, like Jehovah, the Christian god, or Yahweh, whichever name you pick, and then there's Allah, the Islamic god, and then there's the man-made god of communism. When you look at the countries which are still remaining to battle it out.
And the god of materialism. That's another god that that's my whatever. But yeah. These are all memes that are floating around trying to take their spot.
Yeah. And it's going to be interesting. Like maybe the way for that is, do we fracture off these gods into their respective communities? Because again, like the one from the equator, the island fellow who then moved to Iceland, his god would no longer serve him, so he would need to believe in a different god. And it's the same thing would apply for the Icelandic person who then goes and tries to live in what's a good nation that gets like Lower Philippines, right? Or Borneo. So in those areas, it's quite rough.
That's why there's the saying "win in Rome," because
so it'll be interesting, right? Because maybe the cars in different nations will kill different people when accidents were unavoidable. Maybe that's what we'll end up deciding. Which can be quite evidently obvious that
so it just turns out that the Amish god just works.
well, in the Arab world, the
camel god works much better than the Tesla god.
Yeah, no. Well, the Tesla, you would just program the Teslas to not value the gays or the atheists, right? So they would be at the bottom of the rung, right?
Customizable ethics for automated vehicles. Yeah, that's just steer towards the atheists and the gays. Steer away from those that have burqas on. Yeah.
The problem is the amount of sense that makes.
That's programming your cultural ethics into the tools that we're using. I mean, with Jonathan Haidt.
Wait. We also just lost one viewer.
Yeah. With Jonathan Haidt, that's what morality is kind of all about. It's a group culture of ethics for retaining that group status or structure. And so it makes sense to align your tools and property to fit within that moral ethic that you have. That's so weird, though, to think about that. We always think about like having an objective set of standards for all the Teslas, but that would be so weird to specifically program Teslas based off of region.
Yeah. But I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's kind of like, maybe this is when the consciousness things comes out, because are we just robots? Are we just like bricks or walls or plants? Because then it's like, well, at what point does behavior turn from, okay, the Tesla has to react this way on ice compared to this way on wet terrain compared to this way on sand compared to this way on dirt, to when like it's just like another programmed behavior. But then for some reason, when it interacts with what we consider to be conscious entities, then we consider it to be the realm of morality. But yet they're still just programmed behaviors. So that's like an interesting perspective, to just view them as the same thing, but it's only in the context that they differ. And so it's, yeah. All right, I'm running out of time, so let's. I'll just do a quick. I'll just drive through the show notes, and then we'll sign off. So,
do you need to go through the show notes? I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's a good summary. Can't cover everything we talk about for people who joined in later. So, okay, so we start with trying to understand. So, I'm not just talking about this meeting, but in the meetings we did this week. So, we're trying to understand Sam Harris. Care versus liberty may be big five agreeableness. And then Peterson says Sam doesn't take God seriously enough, but in the context of that statement, it was not as serious as Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, or Nietzsche, which other players Sam is contending with. What is Sam's God and atheism? What do they mean? Well, God is a deity, really, to him, and atheism is not believing in those deities. It's the absence of belief in a deity. And claim, well, we don't need to inherit our morality from the stories we grew up with, which is completely true. And, you know, that's an issue that is still there in very religious countries such as the Islamic world. But there is a problem with that, which is one can move away from the supernatural stories, but they can only replace their God. So they can move from religion to an ideology, or they can move to like worshiping a man instead. So it could be worshiping Stalin, or it could be worshiping Soviet Russia or communism.
Or Peterson.
Or any cult, right?
Yeah.
It seems that it's a cult when you believe in a man, and it's a religion or an ideology or religion when you believe in something else. Well, a religion when you believe in a deity, a cult when you believe in a man, and an ideology when you believe in a system. However, ideologies can be good or bad, right? We all need an ideology to remove cognitive dissonance. But what Rand and Peterson talk about with the truth is that we always also need to be humble about our ideology and always view it as never comprehensive, never as all-encompassing. Because if we do, then we are now playing God. And if we play God, then we can justify anything. So that's the issue there, which is then why Nietzsche then talks about, well, we need to become Ubermen. And Rand and Peterson both seem to be on the, holding the torch for that, to try and define and contend and reason about how can we become Ubermen. So how can we act like, well, not act like God, but integrate God in a world without deities. Now, and the reason you need this, again, with the issue with Sam is that just viewing God as a deity is, you still need to define good and bad is the same words as heaven and hell. There's just tools or frameworks of references, ways to act. So God is just the rule maker who sets the rules, which can be considered as spirits, and then we can become inspirited or inspired when we touch those rules, and we can have God's grace when we align with all the rules, as just a way of seeing it. And so the person who doesn't have any God in that definition, the person who doesn't have any ideal to work to, is nihilistic. They're someone who is aimless, and they're generally always depressed. And it's one of the biggest things, which is why there was the absurdism. But absurdism seems to lend itself to hedonism, which hedonism just replaces your God with your whim. Now, whim or impulse is your God, or even your own self is. So, like Alan Watts was a famous absurdist, but he was also a chronic alcoholist and philanderer. So it's there's quite an issue with that. But I'm sure he was perfectly happy. Maybe he didn't have any dissonance. Like, he was able to find an ideology. So hedonism does seem to be an ideology. It does seem like it can remove dissonance, but it doesn't seem as productive. Like, it doesn't seem like it has the same sustainability that the Christian God, that Peterson argues the Christian God has. Peterson also often says Christianity seems to be the best mode there is, because it seems like it is the one most sustainable. But he could be wrong with that. We could all be Muslim in 50 years or 100 years.
Well, I think like Christianity is one of the most memeable. Not like it's able to be spread out in a kind of evangelical sense to people of all different types. Whereas with Islam, I don't know. Well, I mean, Islam has its own system of propagation that is working wonders for it. So,
yeah.
But I was just thinking about how with the other systems of ethics that we were talking about, there's the limitations to it's like they're built-in limitations. Like with objectivism, it has a high appeal to those that are high in disagreeable, or that are low in agreeableness, high in disagreeableness. But it doesn't appeal at all to the people that are more empathetic towards people other than themselves. So the more feminine spirit of trying to help people other than yourself, because that's something that they get a lot of meaning from. And same for like Nietzsche. Like I really love Nietzsche's writing, but he's had his chance to kind of propagate, but it's unlikely that he'll be able to kind of take over compared to like Christianity and Islamism, unless I'm kind of like holding out hope Christianity can like bring in Nietzsche a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah. So the next one is God is an ideal where all the rules spirits converge. Satan is anything that doesn't lead to the ideal. So within Jehovah's Witnesses communities, they often say, well, yeah, like if you're not with God, then you're with Satan. So if you're not working towards the ideal, then Satan has somehow possessed you or is influencing you. Whereas pretty much Satan is always this force that can take you away from the ideal. And it's multifaceted, it's transmorphic, it changes shape. So it's, it can take any form, but its purpose is to pull you away from the ideal. So yeah, to find out what the ideal is, you still need a value judgment, which is the opposite. Once you have judgment, you have the ideal, and then whim, impulse is your God. Well, that's hedonism. God is men, like Hitler and Stalin and Obama. And there's also faceless gods, such as ideologies. So examples can be feminism, Marxism, communism, capitalism could also be one. But then, well, yeah, what is the ideal? And then you need like a moral philosophy. And, previously religions were the guardians of moral philosophy, but there's no need why they need to be, which I think probably everyone agrees on, even Peterson.
You just need a philosophy that's built around meaning, because that's what people have value in.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? Because for the meaning, we're still actually figuring out what is meaningful. And that's something that neuroscience is going to answer. That's something that social sciences is going to answer. That's something that is still going to be subjective to an extent. So it's still something we're still figuring out what is meaningful. Because, and that can change in the time of your life as well. So, it's an interesting a way to try and qualify and measure it.
Yeah, like with Jonathan Haidt, he has the measurements of the 6 cores of moral taste buds. So people find actions that are, or they find more meaning or more value within, say, care within the more liberal sides and the other sides as well. That's like a low resolution indication of what people find meaning within.
Yeah. And it's, for big 5 personality traits, which I think Heitz is also influenced by, like psychoanalysts is trying to figure out how, like tools where you can derive that from. And like the whole point of psychology, it seems, is identify your meaning and then help you work towards it, right? Like it's kind of like trying to help you be a better Christian if you care about being a Christian. It's like, or if you care about Satanism, then it's like, well, figure that out and then help you be that. But it's trying to, help you be, have more grace in your life. So what is the ideal? Peterson does it with his 12 rules. Rand also does it. I'm actually not going to go into that again, besides because we covered that already. But both have really good ways where they try and qualify that their moral philosophy is better than others by actually in the realm of oughts and not in the realms of is, which is interesting. However, Rand's still seems where it values liberty more than compassion. But it's hard then because, again, for Rand, the reason I think her one is superior is I don't know how you can have compassion without having liberty, because if you void liberty, then compassion can destroy liberty, which can then destroy results like caring and wealth. So, but if you have liberty, then you may not have distributed wealth, but it seems incredibly fair because it sustains.
Well, I mean, you can't exactly have enforced monogamy if your sense of liberty is so high up. So, I mean, that's something that even occurs in the books, or people married but then go to somebody that they actually love now.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because maybe this should be the next episode, right? Which is, well, which moral philosophy? How do we qualify one moral philosophy versus another? How can we qualify one God versus the other, and then which God is better? And I'll be the Randian, the objectivist, and figure that one out. All right. So, and then finally, well, what about meaning? So prepare yourself for the calling. Leverage your past with the strength of. So this is my personal way of trying to leverage myself for a calling. So leverage your past with the strength of today to protect your vulnerable future self. We don't really get into that this much in this conversation, but I think maybe I'll pick that up more on my personal channel because it's more related to me. But there's the idea of, well, and I've been reading The Hero's Journey by, I think it's Joseph Campbell is the writer. I could be wrong. Yeah. And so there's this idea where, like you could have a calling, which is kind of like society saying, hey, bucko, we think you're ready to tackle this problem. But to be able to tackle it, you need to be ready. You need to actually be prepared to receive the luck that is given to you. So it's kind of like Peterson, stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's the same rule, which is you need to be prepared for what comes. And you don't know what comes. But it also relates to Steve Jobs. I think it's his Cambridge announcement, commencement speech, where he said that you only, to paraphrase it, you only find meaning via hindsight. You don't ever find it looking forward. And he told the story of studying typography, and it's just like, well, who the hell, like, it's just an interest, right? but it ended up becoming such a meaningful thing in his entire career and through Mac OS. And arguably, it's one of the things that brought great typography to the world. Like maybe it could have been different. So for that, it's interesting because maybe our interests are like these little impulses towards a God. So then it's like, well, if that's the case, then they're certainly not conscious. They're certainly from the unconscious. If our interests are directing us towards a God, in which case that's interesting because then there would be a lot, it's not as subjective as one may think if it is more biological. Okay, so then meaning often comes in hindsight. Yep, entrepreneurship. So personal development as important as career development. You can't have a career if you can't get out of bed. And then meaning is localized, but who wouldn't benefit from pursuing creativity over stagnation? So I think those are some interesting questions to leave it on, which is, how to qualify which God is best and how to qualify meaning. But I think at least in this one, we've done a fairly okay job, reasonable job of answering the what is God question.
Yeah. I feel like I have a better understanding now of like why it is that Sam Harris is unable to talk to theists, or at least like not understand why people are gravitating towards Peterson. Because like, I don't know, maybe Harris considered or thinks that Peterson is directly talking about, I don't know. Never mind. Just his conception of God as being the mythological character Yahweh. It makes a lot more sense now, understanding how he interacts with theists.
Yeah. Alrighty. So let's leave it there, and so this was a discussion for the Jordan B Peterson study group. You can find us at jordanbpeterson.community. So instead of .com.community, every week we have discussions like that. It's all on the website. And we also have a discussion forum which you can participate in. But you can also participate in these meetings. They happen every Saturday. We have private unrecorded ones, and on Sunday we record a summary session. And Saturday ones are private, confidential.
If you're in the US, it's Friday nights and Saturdays too. So
true. The times are different. So we have them in multiple time zones to cater to people around the world. But you can find all the details at jordanbpeterson.community. All right. Thanks, John, and thanks, Tyler, for when you were here, and your lingering presence is appreciated. And I'm Ben. We never said my name earlier. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Great chat. Nice talking to you, Ben.